All right, let's talk about Rome. In Rome, we have another one of these phrases, and it is, in Rome they trained. Okay? So we have one city, one culture that doesn't train. That's the Spartans. Okay? So in Rome we have the training of the individual. Okay? And did I say this one yet? So do you guys already know? Okay, we don't. Okay, so all the time we've got something of the individual in the service of something. Okay? And so what is left? What do you think they did in Rome? They trained the individual in the service of the state. Okay? So we had the obliteration of the individual in the service of the state. We had the training of the individual in the service of God, the training of the individual in the service of culture. In Rome, we have the training of the individual in the service of the state. It begins, I would say, it begins more with a kind of like a cultural training, but it's broader and it is more tied to being a Roman. I suppose in Athens, there's lots of city-states in Greece, and so they have more, it's a democracy, they have more individual control over what's going on there. In Rome, it's not, that part of Roman culture is not like Greece. And so the education of Rome and Roman tradition spreads beyond Rome. And it's connected to being a Roman. So the training of the individual in the service of the state. There's two periods in Roman history, especially Roman education. There's the early period, and that is the type of education that took place before Rome became a dominant empire. And then, of course, there's the Roman education that occurred or was there within the empire. Okay, so if we're looking back in history and we want to learn something, it's safe to assume that the education of the early Roman culture helped at least produce the strength of the Roman Empire. Okay? It wasn't, of course, everything, but that's the way history works, right? Things happen, there's consequences, there's causes, and there's effects. And so when we look at the early education, people would say that this is the education that built the character of the Roman Empire. This early education is what helped build the character of the men, of the people that were able to build the Roman Empire. And ideally, Roman education was training that equipped a man to fulfill his duties. He had duties to the gods, his family, and the state. So an education that is equipping us to fulfill our duties is going to be an education that will have some elements of what we might call character training. You have duties. You have to have the character to follow through and fulfill those duties. So when I say the gods, of course, I mean the multitude of gods, but we should recognize there that there's a spiritual element to education. Okay? They didn't know about Jesus Christ. Obviously, he hadn't even been here yet at that time. And apparently, the Hebrews weren't the city, their shining light wasn't so bright that the Romans saw it. Okay? They were the salt of Palestine, barely, not the salt of the earth. So Romans had gods, but there's a spiritual element to education that we must recognize. In early Rome, education was built on what we might call a peasant foundation. And by that I mean that education wasn't just for nobility. It was for everyone who's a citizen. And all the citizens were were from a peasant race. They were not, in Greece you had nobility, you had all of this, but Rome was a bunch of peasants. Of course, they grew into being very powerful peasants, but that was kind of a mentality. They were the workers. Everybody takes care of themselves. Okay? And so but education was for everyone, you know. So it was an education in tradition. I don't think I've said this recently, but you're going to remember Sparta, even though it was not necessarily desirable to us, it still was passing along from one generation to another what it meant to be a Spartan. Athens the same way, and in Roman education it's passing along a tradition. I think I did say something about when we talked about the paideia, that there's more to education than just what's learned in school, just academic subjects. And also in early Roman education, it was very familial. Familial. It happened within the family. There's a saying, or I'm not going to say the saying because I don't know it specifically, but they felt, because of the strong family nature of it, structure, a child never really came of age while his father lived. Now there was a time when he put off childish things and was given the adult toga, but in a family, the father is the father until he dies, and then you come of age. There was not a lot of what we would call school life in early Roman education. There wasn't any standardized education. It was very different from the Greek education, and there's similarities. Athens didn't have standardized education, but there's differences also. In Greece, the Greek mother wasn't educated well enough to teach her children, and the Greek father was too busy being a citizen to educate his children. So they went to schools, and there was a lot of variety in the schools. But they went to schools. They went to a teacher. By the way, they were brought to the teacher by a slave who made sure that they didn't run off with their friends. The slave kept them out of trouble until they got to the teacher. Okay? And the slave is called a schoolmaster. Yep. The schoolmaster kept them out of trouble until they got to the teacher. Okay. I'm just helping you there with Galatians a little bit. Okay. The schoolmaster was not the teacher. He would teach some things, but not much. He kept them out of trouble until they got to the teacher. Just like the law kept the Hebrews out of trouble until they got to the teacher. And the teacher is Christ. So, anyway. Whoa. Okay, it's 10 till chapel. And we're moving right along. So, in Roman education, in contrast, mothers were educated. Maybe they weren't educated as much as the fathers, but they were educated. They could teach their children, get them started. And the fathers there wasn't this big system of government, city government, or everybody were peasants. They worked hard, and the fathers trained their children. In fact, and so they had mostly a homeschooling situation, we might call it, in early Roman education. Homeschooling situation. If they used a nurse, it was imperative that she speak correctly, because the child is going to hear her speaking, her speech, and he or she is going to copy how the nurse speaks. And it was really good if she was a philosopher. So obviously, if a nurse is a philosopher, she's had some training. Different kind of view there. Mothers are very important. The Roman home was permeated with a religious atmosphere. They felt a strong duty to their gods. Then at the age of 7, there's a deliberate association with the father. At the age of 7, there's a deliberate association. Obviously, he's with his father, but before that, but there's like always by his father's side, basically. He's his constant companion. His father is his teacher. So whatever his father is doing, he's there with him. As opposed to our culture today, where whatever the kids are doing, the parents are there with them. There's a difference. Nothing wrong with going to a kid's baseball game, but the father's duties are more important than the kid's baseball game. So, the child is the constant companion of the father. The father is his only teacher, and the father is a living representation of what it means to be a Roman. He sees him working on the farm. He sees him participating in the community or national festivals. He sees him going down to the forum and watching what's going on there or making speeches there. Whatever it is, he's with his father for about 7 years. Between 14 and 17, some people say always at 16, but in that middle teen age, he's given the adult toga, and he puts off childish things. His name is listed as a full citizen of Rome, and those are not the important things, and then he is sent to live and learn from a distinguished friend. Okay, so he's grown up. He's 14, 15, 16, 17, somewhere in there. He's an adult, he's a full citizen, and he goes off to live with a friend. So he's learned from his father, now he's learning from his father's friend. An adult, he's not learning from his own friends, from a family friend. And so he's learning kind of basically the same type of things, but just from another man's perspective. He's not learning technical things, not really philosophical, unless it's just by, through his pores, and not specific knowledge, even though he has knowledge. It's very much a passing on of what it means to be a Roman. It's a transmission of tradition, which is what education is. Whether we recognize it or not, it's what takes place in education. So if we don't address it, or if we act like it's not there, we're foolish. Or if we deny that it's there, we're evil. We're trying to hide something that's being transmitted. Joy.
All the stuff that you're going over, like being with the father and all that stuff, is that strictly boys? Like, is this...
generally, yes. But somehow the women were educated, because mothers could teach. So I don't know, it's not right here at the top of my head, the distinction between how much girls had education and boys, but in all ancient cultures, the boys had more education than the girls. Sometimes the girls had no education. Sometimes they had, well, and even if they had no education, they were always, they're learning household things so that they could be a mother. And in Greek, you know, the mom, she still ran the home, but didn't have, you know, she'd have a slave to keep accounts and whatever, and a slave to go to the market and all, whatever. So, but, yeah? I cut you off. I forgot to. So nowadays, there is a lot of study or surmising in women's education, women's studies, and I don't mean to denigrate over half of my class, okay, because it is important that you learn, but I don't, so anyway, yeah?
Were women citizens of Rome?
I don't think so. I think it was just men. Of course, if you were the wife of a citizen, you'd. So, we're running late. Let me just say, we'll talk about quintillion the next time, or I'll give you an assignment about quintillion. I have 1 or 2 points about later education, and it's just this. As Rome became an empire, the fathers were not home. They were away, either conquering or governing cities that they conquered, maintaining the empire. So once the empire is spreading out, there develops a school system. Okay? Before it was a family type education. As families are separated and spread out by covering the empire, there's a school system back home for the kids. 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 Back home for the kids.